Well, hello everyone. It's an honor to be with all of you today. I have been asked to share about my own story and journey with regard to being Jewish and being a follower of Messiah. So I thought I would just give you an overview of my story and kind of hone in on specific moments and events that were really significant. So I was raised in a Jewish home in Lake Tahoe, California. So both of my parents were raised in some form of the Jewish community in Los Angeles. And then they got married and moved to Lake Tahoe, which is where I was raised. And at least back then, there was not much Jewish community to speak of in Tahoe. There still is actually one Reform temple here that my parents were not that interested in. So we had a fairly strong Jewish identity in our home, and I had a fairly strong sense of what it meant, at least at the time as a child, to be Jewish. We celebrated Passover, we celebrated Hanukkah, but it didn't, I wouldn't say it was a real significant part of my identity growing up, but it was something that I was very aware of. It's interesting looking back, my best friend was Catholic, and I actually even remember like going to mass with her, but never talking about it. Like I didn't know anything about Judaism or Christianity. I mean, I knew Judaism, but I didn't understand really what Christianity was until I went to college, which is sort of the next chapter of my journey. I went to Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, which is just a large public state school in California. And I happened to be there at a really interesting time where there was almost like this, not like a revival, but just an explosion of Christian activity and student body membership at Cal Poly. So, for example, the Campus Crusade chapter went from 30 people to 1,000 people in a 5-year period, and that was the time that I was there. So there were just a lot of Christians there and a lot of like Christian campus ministry and energy. And so it just so happens that my randomly assigned freshman roommate was a strong Christian, as was my next door neighbor in the dorms, who became my closest friend in college. And so it's fascinating to look back to realize that I never actually heard the gospel. Like I did not know who the person of Yeshua was until college. And so college for me became a real wrestling time with the claims of Messiah. And I felt this real bifurcation between my Jewish self and all of these Christian friends that I had. And so, for example, I went to the Hillel meetings on our campus a number of times, and I just was like a seeker. Like I just had so many questions and all these like theology and God and identity, and Hillel was not talking about those things. Like it was very secular, and it just was not, the conversations there were not the conversations that were energizing for me. I started attending church really because I didn't like being the only kid in the dorm room on a Sunday morning my freshman year. And my roommate just went to a non-denominational church. I went there with her a handful of times, and then she started attending a vineyard church plant, actually. So it was very new. A lot of young people, most of them were also like Cal Poly undergrads. And it was really once I started going to the vineyard church with her that I just had this desire to press into the conversations that were being had there, the sort of spiritual life that I saw in these vineyard Christians. So I started attending church. I did like a summer project with them. I did like a reading, like a book club kind of thing with the vineyard church there. Interestingly, on Dallas Willard's book, The Spirit of the Disciplines, which has been a very influential book for me ever since. And so it was my last year as an undergrad that I felt like through a series of events that people have kind of tried to ask me to pin down, and it's very hard for me to pin down, I basically just came to a point where I believed that Yeshua was who he said he was. And so that caused me to change direction radically. I was a political science major as an undergrad, and I was planning to go to law school. I wanted to be a Supreme Court justice. And I just scrapped that whole plan, and instead I went to divinity school. So that's kind of the next chapter. I went to Yale Divinity School to do an MDiv right after. I actually took a year off, and I read through the whole Bible, and I read every theology book I could get my hands on. And then I went to Yale, which was just a fascinating place to be digging into Christian theology. So I became especially passionate about the theology of Karl Barth, who's a 20th century Protestant Christian theologian, one of the bigger Christian theologians, and just was fascinated. And what happened was that I didn't know how to reconcile these two parts of my identity. And so when I became a follower of Messiah, I essentially just set aside my Jewishness because I didn't know any other Jewish followers of Messiah. I didn't know anything about Messianic Judaism, nothing. So I just kind of set that aside and went into the church world. I became a believer in the context of this Vineyard Church as an undergrad, and I bounced around to a number of different churches once I got to Yale. I ended up in an Episcopal church, which I liked a lot. But it only makes sense in retrospect to me why I never found like a church home or a denominational home. So Yale was just a time for me of deepening my understanding and my passion for Christian theology, really. And it's where this sense of vocation came for me that, like, yes, I want to study and teach theology in some form for the rest of my life. And it was actually my last year at Yale that the Jewish piece, which I had kind of buried, kind of just put on the shelf, began to re-emerge through my relationship with my cousin at the time. So I was in New Haven, Connecticut. She was living in New York City, and she was going through Orthodox conversion. Her father was Jewish, her mother was not. And so we would meet up, and I would share with her all this stuff that I was learning about Christian theology and spiritual disciplines, and she would share with me this whole process of conversion and meeting with the rabbi. And it was really through my relationship with her that this whole Jewish piece began to come back up, and I started to have a sense that maybe I had left something really, really significant behind in my sort of pursuit of Christian faith. And so that brings me to the next chapter of the journey, which was I went on to Fuller Seminary to do my PhD because I was so passionate about theology, particularly Karl Barth. And it was once I showed up at Fuller and I told my doctoral advisor, who turned out to be this really significant person in my life, that I was Jewish. And he paused, and he was kind of the first person who told me, like, Jen, that matters, and that impacts the way that you do Christian theology. And he said, you need to meet my friend Mark Kinzer. And so I don't know for how many of you this applies, but meeting Mark Kinzer changed my life. And I've met plenty of people who, like, there's like the before Mark and the after Mark chapters of their life. And so I met Mark, and Mark assured me that there were lots of other people like us out there. And basically what happened is that my entire academic trajectory started to like filter into Jewish Christian relations, the Jewishness of the New Testament, the way in which Christian thought has historically had all of these problems and still does with regard to its relationship to the people of Israel. And so once Mark came on the scene, my entire doctoral project, my dissertation, became all about these questions, and particularly Jewish Christian relations in the 20th and 21st century. And I also started to, Mark was also just this wonderful mentor, and he still is to this day in terms of like, what does this mean for me personally? And so I started, I also was attending an Episcopal church in Pasadena when I was at Fuller, and I started attending Stuart Dowerman's Messianic Jewish congregation. It's not led by Stuart Dowerman anymore. And I would go to church on Sunday and Messianic congregation on Saturday, and eventually just more and more became comfortable over a number of years self-identifying as a Messianic Jew and realizing that this marginalized in-between movement is where I find myself fitting in. And so since then, my scholarship has continued to be in this vein, and I have increasingly just sort of embraced this identity as a Messianic Jew. I ended up getting set up with my husband on a trip to Israel in 2012, he grew up in the Messianic Jewish movement and had made Aliyah to Israel after high school. And so he was almost like this next step for me of moving in this direction. He's really challenged and pushed me in terms of Jewish observance and like putting our money where our mouth is when the rubber hits the road in terms of what does it mean to live as Jews. So we got married in 2013. We spent the first 2 years of our marriage living in Jerusalem. And we have since sort of unexpectedly relocated back to California, where we live close to my family, which is really special for me. And we kind of find ourselves in this gap between the church world and the like mainstream normative Jewish world. So we have our Christian community in Lake Tahoe, which is where we live, and we're very involved with the Chabad Jewish community here. which is especially important to my husband. And so it's kind of been this winding journey, but it has brought me to finally what I feel is a place of authenticity, where I'm not leaving behind my Jewishness and I'm not putting Messiah on the shelf, but we're really just trying to figure out what it looks like wherever we are, whether we're in Jerusalem or Lake Tahoe, to honor both of those really central key aspects of our identity. And I'm so grateful for people like Mark Kinzer, who have just been such important support to me along, and his wife Roz. And I mean, I could just name so many people who've been key mentors and friends and like fellow travelers for me on this journey that has just been so rich. And I'm excited to see where it goes from here. So thanks for the opportunity to share. And it's, like I said, it's just a joy to be a part of this organization, to be with all of you, and to feel that we're not in it alone, which is true. Thanks, everybody.